It's really a pleasure to join you all today, and I'm going to share my screen so that I can share some slides with you while we talk today. And then I'll say a few words about who I am. All right, terrific. Well, first of all, let me say it's just a pleasure to join you. I can tell there's a lot of fantastic energy in the room and you're excited for the meeting that you're having, which I've been to lots of meetings where there's not that level of excitement. So you must have some lucky and very capable and talented organizers to get you all together to consider some hopefully very interesting topics. My name is Joseph Gaughan. I'm a psychologist and interdisciplinary social scientist. I teach at Harvard. I'm a researcher predominantly, and I study the intersection of culture, coloniality, and mental health in American Indian and other indigenous communities. I'm from Montana originally. I'm an enrolled member of the Aani-Grovant tribal nation, Fort Belknap Indian Reservation in north central Montana. And I'm talking today from San Diego, California, and which of course is not so far from where you are today. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person, however. And I've been asked to talk to you today about Indigenous cultural and spiritual traditions. And in my career, I've been very fortunate in the work that I do in partnerships with tribal communities to be attuned to the ways in which culture and spirituality play important roles in efforts to address mental health inequities. So that's really what I want to talk to you today. I'll just start by just reminding you some of what I just said. I'm an academic psychologist. I clarify that because, you know, if you're not that familiar with psychology, you might think that I put people on the couch and I only do therapy and counseling. I am clinically trained, but because of the research that I do, I don't really practice clinically so much. I'm more community engaged and very culturally attuned in the work that I do because I'm trying to think about how do we undertake innovations in counseling and mental health services in a way that might be better tailored for American Indian communities. So my research interests at the broad intersection of culture and mental health. Because of my work with Indigenous communities, I think a lot about facets of Indigenous psychology and try to come up with and design in partnership with community members cross-cultural interventions that might better suit their needs. Here on the right, you have a photo of a picture I took at one of the institutions I partnered with. This was their sacred room where clients could go and pray and offer smoke to those above. So I have two simple goals today, and we don't want to get too technical about it. Really, I'm going to tell you a couple stories about the work that I've done. But I do want, in the purpose of this presentation, to define for you what I call a post-colonial predicament of community mental health services for American Indians, and the ways in which Indigenous communities end up harnessing Indigenous culture as treatment for trying to address this predicament. So that's really pretty simple and straightforward what I'm hoping to accomplish today, and to give you some really concrete examples about how these things occur. So let's jump right in then with what I call this post-colonial predicament. It's really, I had a very early career lesson over 20 years ago. My first research project, I went home to my own reservation in Montana to try to understand the links between culture, drinking, and depression. But before I get to that, let's just make sure we're really clear that there are these mental health inequities or disparities across many Indigenous communities in which these problems have been studied. So on the one hand, we have pronounced mental health problems. This is true especially for addiction, trauma, suicide. You probably have heard about that because it's widely covered in the media. On the other hand, the services we have on offer to help remedy those, the behavioral health services or the mental health services and addiction treatment services, they're really deeply underfunded. They're funded predominantly by the Federal Indian Health Service, which has an obligation to provide healthcare for Native people. But in this case, they're just not funded very well at all. And so based on this assessment, one might conclude that the solution to this problem is simple, that mental health inequities in our communities could be easily remedied if we simply expanded the mental health services, that we funded them adequately, we hired more providers, and we made services more widely available through extra clinics and that kind of thing. That seems simple and straightforward. But again, I undertook this very early career research endeavor on my home reservation that complicated this assumption for me. So basically, I went home and I was trying to set aside my training as a clinician in order instead to ask an open-ended and discovery-oriented fashion, more in an anthropological mode, to find out how people in my own community thought about mental health, in quotes, and the kinds of problems that were most troubling and the ways in which community members had in mind to remedy those. And I interviewed a lot of people, talked with a lot of people, but I ended up focusing on a single interview with a middle-aged grassroots traditionalist from my community, someone who's gone back to Indigenous traditional practices, because he had really illuminating things to say about the mental health problems at home. And he, in our work together, decided to go by his Indian name of Traveling Thunder. And in this interview, he offered what we call an explanatory model for where these problems come from, what they are like, how you might intervene to remedy them. And Traveling Thunder really explained the origins and the troubles associated with problem drinking and depression in our community, with reference to 4 historical epochs or 4 historical eras. Here's what he observed about these things. You can see the eras listed here. The first era he described sounded like paradise. It was kind of an era before Europeans arrived to this hemisphere. And the way he characterized Indian life at that time was that it was a kind of perfect harmony and balance, owing to a really strict observation of custom. He talked about the importance of this custom for Indigenous life and that everybody observed it, and therefore that's why there was a good existence. Of course, Europeans did arrive. This inaugurated this second era, this era of conquest, which was a period of colonial contact in which arriving Europeans really sought to colonially subjugate and dispossess our peoples and communities. That is, they took our land and corralled us on reservations and tried to contain and hoped we would just go away, disappear, go extinct, essentially. And a lot of that project involved an attack on our ways of life, an attack on the very customs that kept things organized and oriented prior to European arrival. So it led to this annihilation of Indigenous custom. Well, when you attack people in that way, the after effects are fairly predictable. And so this third era that Traveling Thunder referenced was one of loss, in which there are these post-colonial or after-colonial effects. And the way he talked about it basically referred to a kind of what we in psychology would call anomie. Anomie means a loss of purpose, belonging, identity, and orientation to how to live a good life. And it was this kind of loss of all of those important compass points for what a good life is like that, according to Traveling Thunder, led to pathology, led to drinking and depression, and ultimately maybe suicide even. And importantly, Traveling Thunder really clearly identified the source of this pathology, the origins of this whole pathogenic chain, this sickness chain, as the white man system. That's how we referred to it. The white man system was set up and it really caused these problems. Well, the good news is Traveling Thunder didn't think we were trapped in that era of loss. He talked about a fourth era, an era of possibility, of post-colonial remedy even, through revitalization of Indigenous custom and tradition. And for many of our communities, this came about in the 1970s in the wake of the Red Power or American Indian movement, in which people became proud of being Indian again and started to look back to traditions and ceremonies and rituals from the past to have those be practiced again in modern times. And so he identified this as potentially beneficial because he underscored this return to Indigenous custom, the custom that we started with that was disrupted, that led to all of these problems, but now you can return to it, especially the sacred and ritual and ceremonial aspects of that custom. And that has the best chance of remedying the very problems that were created through the original disruption of this process. And so just to abstract out a little bit, Traveling Thunder's model, his explanation, his account for why our community contends with problem drinking, depression, suicide, and so on, and what can be done, really built on this historical understanding. He identified a really clear pathological process, a disease process or a disorder process, in which colonial subjugation involved cultural repression, a disruption of those customs that led to kind of an anomie, which is loss of identity, purpose, and orientation, which then he said would lead to substance abuse, depression, worthlessness, and even suicide. So he unfolded that linked chain just like that. Interestingly, he didn't have a lot to say about individual distress or this person or that person. He really talked about our community as a whole, our collective group as of experiencing these issues. He didn't offer what is familiar to mental health professionals. He didn't talk about biology like genetic predispositions or brain chemistry imbalances. He didn't talk even much about psychology, which would be early family dynamics or defense mechanisms or stuff going on inside one's own mind. Instead, Traveling Thunder's account emphasized history, culture, and spirituality as really the domains that mattered for accounting for these kinds of problems. Finally, as I said, he really underscored and emphasized that all of this came about because of colonial subjugation, because of European arrival, conquest, dispossession, and the setting up of what he called the white man system. So he was identifying colonization as the initial, original, inaugural cause of native distress. And in doing so, he was really emphasizing systemic factors over intrapersonal factors, things going on in the ways your society is organized more so than what's going on inside your own mind or body. In doing so, he emphasized really shared community vulnerabilities. Again, it wasn't about this individual or that family, but about all of us. And the way people talk about this today, 20 years later, more than 20 years later, is the term historical trauma. You might have heard of this term historical trauma. It first was originated with the Holocaust survivors and their offspring in Jewish psychoanalytic treatment of those folks, but it's been imported to Indigenous communities now. And essentially, it captures pretty much exactly what I've just talked about in terms of Traveling Thunder's explanatory model, with one little exception, which is that Traveling Thunder never made reference to trauma. So trauma is a term that has become very popular and very widely circulating in our society and throughout the globe within the past 25 years or so. So if we had an interview like this today at home, probably people would talk about trauma, but Traveling Thunder didn't. Trauma is a psychological term. It means psychic injury. And so it's interesting that Traveling Thunder didn't use it because, as I said, he wasn't offering a very psychological account. Well, if you're thinking about this like I did, you might wonder, well, okay, well, what is the relevance then of like counseling and mental health services, the kinds of things that are on offer in the IHS on most reservations? So I put it to Traveling Thunder. I said, I think I follow you here, but let's say you had a loved one who's going through a really tough time in crisis. Under what conditions would you take them down to the IHS clinic at the reservation and get them help from the clinicians there? Well, he grew quiet in response to that, and it felt like 15 seconds before he said something. And when he spoke up, he talked pretty deliberately and pretty soberly. And here's what he had to say about mental health services. Quote, I guess it's like a war, but they're not using bullets anymore. They want to wipe us out, and therefore the Indian problem will be gone forever. But they're using a more shrewder way than the old style of bullets. If you look at the big picture, you look at your past, your history, where you come from, and you look at your future where the white man's leading you, I guess you can make a choice. Where do I want to end up? I guess a lot of people want to end up looking good to the white man. Then it'd be a good thing to do. Go to the white psychiatrist in the Indian Health Service and say, well, go ahead and rid me of my history, my past, and brainwash me forever so I can be like a white man. I guess that'd be a choice each individual will have to make. And so in these words, Traveling Thunder really identified mental health treatment of the kind that's on offer at IHS for Indian people on a reservation setting as a cross-cultural encounter, like that many people wouldn't really fully understand or appreciate or regard that as useful, helpful treatment. But more importantly, he was attesting to its ideological functions. He called it a form of brainwashing. And in that sense, he was calling attention to mental health services as being forms of maybe tacit or implicit, under the radar kinds of cultural missionary work, proselytization, we could call it. And so Traveling Thunder had a very clear sense of skepticism and even concern about what mental health services might be doing for people who take advantage of them in the reservation context. All of this then sets up early in my career, as I said, what I identified as the post-colonial predicament for community mental health services in Indian country. On the one hand, we have pretty urgent community needs. We live often in impoverished, high-risk settings. There are these documented inequities in mental health status, like addiction, trauma, suicide. On the other hand, the clinical services that are on offer are often incongruent with what we might need. So we have Traveling Thunder complaining that their invitations to brainwash me forever so I can be like a white man. In other words, there's an ideological component to them. This has been attested to everywhere I go in Indian country when I talk to people about these issues. And of course, research evidence can pick it up as well. There was an important study done on 8 reservations and reserves in the Great Lakes region. Part of it involved asking hundreds of people from those communities, if you were in crisis and needed help, who would you turn to? And mental health counselors and professionals don't even make the top 10. So, the fact that these services are not necessarily what people think would be the most helpful or effective in Indian country has really come through. So that was my first project. It opened my eyes to attending to what mental health services and treatments as usual might be viewed as and regarded by in terms of some Indian communities. And so I wanted to go in my next project to a community to study how they were interested in integrating different kinds of approaches to treatment, both usual modern counseling techniques, but also indigenous therapeutic and healing traditions, and to see what was going on in their effort to integrate these. So in terms of this post-colonial predicament, again, needs on the one hand, but incongruent services on the other, part of what we learn from that is that all clinical intervention, all treatment, all counseling and helping services are themselves forms of cultural prescription. There's no universal view from nowhere, that everybody can take to, that these things have embedded within them cultural assumptions and orientations about what it means to be sick, what it means to be well, how one goes about healing, and those sorts of things. And we want to acknowledge specifically from Traveling Thunder the hazards of a kind of ongoing cultural colonialism that can happen through mental health services for at least some swath of the American Indian community population. Relatedly, I think we want to then take very serious consideration of the kind of claim I hear everywhere I go in Indian country, in which, if you offer the latest, greatest mental health treatment that scientists have studied and done experimental research on, many Indian people say, that's well and good, but we don't need that. Our culture is our treatment. And what they mean by that is they're referring to therapeutic alternatives that are based on often reclaimed or revitalized traditional practices that we've taken pride in and tried to bring back to life since the 1970s. This claim is grounded in a more holistic rationale of not just mental health, but health more generally with mind, body, spirit, and emotion, grounded primarily in spirituality and religious experience especially. And in being more holistic and engaged in spirituality and religious experience, it ends up being addressed not just to personal or individual distress, although that's really important because people are suffering and they need relief and help, but it also buttresses cultural identity, which is not just individual, but shared, it's cultural identity, and community renewal and self-determination as well. So my next project was in partnership with a Canadian First Nation Healing Lodge. This was in Manitoba, Canada, on one of the Cree reserves up there. So it was a Western Algonquian First Nation community. It was operating its own addiction treatment center that was accountable to the band. And we say tribes in the United States, but in Canada they say bands or First Nations. It was all tribally staffed, and it was nationally accredited. So there were, programs like this throughout Canada, but not that many of them at this time, at least, were accredited. That's a hard set of hoops to jump. I focus predominantly on the outpatient substance abuse treatment program. That means that counselors there were working on helping people in the community who lived on that reserve. They had an inpatient, a residential program as well, where people came from all over Western Canada to live there. But I'm talking about the groups that worked with community members. And my interest there was their overt commitment to integrating what they called Western and what they called Aboriginal therapeutic practices. Aboriginal's gone by the wayside in Canada. Now we would say Indigenous, and that's what I'll say. But at the time they said Aboriginal. So, I had some questions. One question was, simply what does therapeutic practice look like in this setting? Like, can we describe it so it's more clear what's happening? Then on the basis of that, what does healing mean in this therapeutic context? How would I be able to elucidate the meaning of healing from the activities people were engaging in? And finally, what are the prospects and pitfalls of therapeutic integration of the Western and the Aboriginal in a setting like this? In other words, what are the implications? And I engaged in brief ethnography and interviewed a lot of people and so on. So the first question is, what does therapeutic practice look like? Description, So the first thing is that counselors and clients all understood that there were Western approaches to treatment and Aboriginal approaches to treatment. And so Western approaches to treatment, they described first and foremost, because it's an addiction treatment program, as the 12 steps and traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous. And they talked about how important that was as a foundation. And then there's lots of other things they were open to and excited about that they either had pulled in or wanted to pull in. So some of the things that they talked about, they hadn't yet established, they just were interested in them. many complementary and alternative treatments, or kind of alternative health kinds of things. People there were talking about neuro-linguistic programming. People were talking about inner child work, about Reiki massage therapy, about the 7 sacred chakras. I mean, people were just interested in a lot of alternative health stuff that they could pull in addition to the 12 steps of AA. There was a complete absence of what we think of as evidence-based treatments for substance abuse. You know, the United States spends millions of dollars on research projects to try to develop, you know, the latest, greatest treatment techniques, but this wasn't something that folks in this clinic knew about or were especially interested in. Really, what was most appealing to them was spirituality. And sometimes nebulous, you know, 7 sacred chakras or neuro-linguistic programming. You know, it's the spirituality for those approaches are not the same as for the traditional community here, which is probably why it was non-Indigenous approaches to spirituality and why they lumped it in as Western. So these are what they called Western practices or approaches. They also then had what they called Aboriginal, or what today we would call Indigenous approaches. These were really familiar practices that if you're familiar with Indian country at all, or you know about Indigenous traditions, there were talking circles, smudging, which is the burning of sacred plant medicines for prayer and cleansing, sweat lodge ceremonies, pipe ceremonies, and they even held fasting camps in the summertime for clients who could go out and seek a vision or a dream. These Aboriginal approaches were institutionalized into the treatment program. For example, the sweat lodge was offered every Thursday afternoon. In addition, it was offered by a cultural counselor who was hired on. His job was to offer these kinds of traditional treatments. Anytime that a community is revitalizing and reclaiming traditions from the past, there can be issues and concerns around the authenticity of those approaches, like who are you to be offering them? How did you learn this? How do we know it's continuous with the past? Is it ours or someone else's that's being brought in when it comes to Indigenous approaches? Unfortunately, in this community, those weren't too severe. They're everywhere where this stuff happens. Sometimes they're paralyzing, but that was not the case here so much. And so you have Western approaches, you have Aboriginal approaches going on, people excited, enthusiastic, and being on offer. How on earth does all of this come together into a coherent and unified approach to treatment? And the answer was more of a model or philosophy of treatment that was based on the medicine wheel. So the medicine wheel, which I have one example of here, is a circle bisected by 2 perpendicular lines to create 4 quadrants. And then the Indigenous medicine wheel is often understood to index or invoke directional space and cyclical time. So directional space has to do with the 4 quadrants. You can see you've got east on the right there, south, west, and north. Those are the 4 cardinal directions, and one of those quadrants is associated with one of those. That's directional space, 4 quadrants. And then you also have a circle. You can enter at the east in that yellow part and trace a clockwise circle all the way around to you could exit at the east as well. And that's meant to invoke cyclical time. That is time that doesn't necessarily have a beginning and end, but goes round and round and round through 4 phases. So seasonal time starts in the east with the spring, then summer, then fall, then winter, and then spring again. So that's what the medicine wheel is kind of getting at. Its underlying philosophy is one of balance across 4 constituent parts. The ideal of the medicine wheel is 4 in 1. 4 things, elements, constituents, or parts that you need to attend to or consider, but they all come together in balance into a unified totality. Now, in treatment, what this has done is apply to human psychology. In some ways, it becomes what we might call a map or a topography of the self. In other words, the 4 quadrants were mind, body, spirit, and emotion. Mind, body, spirit, and emotion. These are the 4 components of human life or existence, but they have to be considered in balance and harmony for a total holistic well-being. In addition, there's a rendering of the human lifespan. So that's the cyclical time. You enter at the east as a child, you go on to adolescence, then adulthood, then old age. And the idea here is you enter in childhood, complete dependence on other people, and you move through life and then come back in ancient, when you're really old, to dependency on people again. It's cyclical in that way. So again, the medicine wheel is the way that people understood how treatment was unfolding. And so it didn't matter whether you took advantage of this particular Western approach or this particular Aboriginal approach. The important thing is that you were attending to mind, body, spirit, and emotion, and engaging in activities that would help you to attend to those things and achieve a harmonic balance in them toward well-being. So that was the description of what was going on in terms of healing. Then the therapeutic practice. The next question had to do with, well, then what's the meaning of healing? Like, how did they understand healing there? And the thing about people's understandings is we often know a lot more than we can really tell. For example, for all of you, I presume that you're English speakers, and I could ask you all kinds of things about English grammar that you wouldn't be able to really explain, and yet you know it because you use it every day in fluent ways. And so when you explicate or elucidate things, you're pulling out the meanings that are sometimes underneath the surface that people can't always talk about. But people talk about some things. So in terms of explicit meanings of healing, people talked about spiritual, or if you like, existential transformations that linked imperfect selves to some higher purpose. And in this context, especially, it involved a post-colonial reclamation of a healthy, robust Indigenous cultural identity. Cultural identity is really key here, in part because this program was trying to be an antidote to the damage of the residential schools in Canada, which took kids away from their families and taught them to be ashamed of being Indian and tried to civilize them into little white people. And so that damage to one's identity is the source of a lot of problems in the way that Traveling Thunder sort of talked about. And so a reclamation of robust, healthy identity is very important. Well, this is what people could talk about, but there were clear things going on that people couldn't say so much about, but were also really important for healing. What was really clear from everyone I talked to was these three components were also part of healing. The idea of emotional burdens, cathartic expression, and self as project introspection. So emotional burdens was the idea that all of us carry around, or certainly in treatment, clients carry around unexpressed pain from the past, maybe from childhood neglect or abuse or something that undermines present day functioning. That there's all this stuff they're carrying that they have never really dealt with in some way, and therefore it's derailing their modern contemporary life. And so one needs to encourage them in therapeutic activity to engage in cathartic expression. That is, they could release this unexpressed pain if they could verbally express, almost confess even, disclose these past ordeals in therapeutic settings that can start to restore them to wellness. But that this cathartic expression was just the beginning. One then had to take on lifelong practices of self-examination, self-awareness, working on oneself in order to proceed toward wellness. And this whole journey is referred to as a healing journey, in which one takes oneself almost as a therapeutic project to manage and to monitor really for the rest of your life. So you have pain from the past that you haven't expressed. In therapy, you can start to express and release this pain through verbal confession or articulation of it. And then you take the self as a project that you work on for the rest of your life. And so we end up with a summary meaning of healing between the explicit and the tacit implicit stuff. And I'll just give you a few seconds to just read this definition that followed. And so you can see that, this is the way healing, hopefully it's all clear from the things I already told you. Buttressing Aboriginal identity was really important. And as I said, there was a bridging of the individual and the community in some important ways. So the counselors who worked in this program didn't only work with clients in the program, they went out into the community to hold workshops, to hold grieving activities, to hold ceremonies about the residential schools and their negative effects, for example. And additionally, people from the community could come into the treatment center. They could come eat lunch with clients and staff. They could participate in the sweat lodge ceremony on Thursday afternoon. So the boundary between treatment and clientele and community was not so rigidly drawn as it is in many, many instances. So that was the meaning, the elucidation. What then are the implications of this for efforts to integrate, modern and Indigenous therapeutic approaches and practices toward better well-being? Well, what's interesting here is, all that stuff about the carrying past pain that's unexpressed and verbally confessing it in a therapeutic setting to start to release and begin one's healing journey. is probably pretty familiar as what we might call modern therapy culture. Modern therapy culture is pretty widely circulating, from self-help books, pop psych books, every television talk show trots a psychologist out for 10 minutes who can tell everyone what the problem is and solve the issue, in 55 minutes or what have you. So it's very Freudian in the sense that we, have repressed pain that we have to confess, pop psychoanalysis. But there was a lot of staff enthusiasm for this because the counselors themselves who had contended with addiction in their own lives had found this approach really, really useful. And so they were really enthusiastic about sharing it with other members of the community. One challenge, I think, was there are ways in which modern therapy culture runs afoul of certain cultural orientations and perspectives in our communities. That is, there were questions about cultural commensurability of this modern therapy culture approach. So one index that this was worth considering was because it turns out a lot of clients never finished the program. Like, they voted with their feet. It may be only 10% of the clients even went through all 12 weeks of the program. So in some sense, something clearly was not fully appealing to them. Although, people with substance abuse issues certainly have chaotic lives. So we have to be careful. I'm just positing kind of an important hypothesis here. But, the norms in our community for who talks with whom about what and under which conditions are really different than the mandates of modern therapy culture. Indian life is about family reputation. You live often in small communities where face-to-face interaction is the norm for an entire lifespan. So, who talks with whom is patterned very differently. You're very careful maybe about talking in public, especially about things that could be damaging to your family's reputation or damaging to your reputation. So I think there was a lot of client reticence, client caution in talking in therapy groups in the way that people hoped they would. And I think that accounts in part for why there was maybe some limited reach of this program for many people from the community. And so what that raised for me was a question. In this setting, we could say that there was kind of a core therapy culture component about this, burdens from the past and confessing, disclosing, and so on, overlaid with Indigenous practice and tradition. And I started to wonder, what would a therapy program look like that started with Indigenous tradition and then overlaid the modern stuff onto that? And so that led me then to a third and final program that I'll talk about today, just to give you a sense for this alternative possibility. So the usual approach for cultural adaptation of counseling and treatment is that you take preferably a scientifically vetted treatment approach, maybe one that's in a manual. There's kind of a script to follow. It tells you what to do. And then you figure out how you make it tailored for a community that has some cultural differences. Maybe use different narratives. Maybe you speak a different language. Maybe use different metaphors or symbols. Your pictures would have folk of color maybe instead of white folk or something like that. So the usual approach is to start with mainstream stuff and adapt these secondarily for use in diverse community mental health. But I wondered what would happen on the basis of that last project if we started with an inverted approach to this. What if you began with Indigenous therapeutic traditions and then secondarily cultivated those for use as interventions within community mental health? And so I approached the Blackfeet Nation's addiction treatment program, which is known as the Crystal Creek Lodge in Browning, Montana. And I initiated a dialogue with the staff in the spring of 2008, in which I just had a meeting with all of them, including the director and the leadership, and sort of said, look, you run an addiction treatment program here. It's mostly the model that's available throughout the country. You've brought it into your own community, and you've certainly tailored it a bit. You've got a cultural counselor, you've got a few groups that involve cultural content, but really it's a 12 steps AA-based program that you've dressed in beads and feathers. And I wonder what you would think about the effort to start with Blackfeet therapeutic tradition and figure out what treating and helping addiction clients would look like based on that. And they were very excited, enthusiastic about that. So that was our partnership could be formed. And then the other thing we wanted to do was to get some scientific outcome evidence because one thing that Native communities who harness culture, tradition, and spirituality for mental health have trouble with is getting funding for these things, because a lot of the government funding agencies want proof that they work or want scientific evidence that they actually help people before they give funds out. So the idea was to try to get some scientific evidence as well. Well, they were interested enough that we had an extended deliberation the following summer, in which we really committed to formulating a Blackfeet treatment model. And the question was how to do that. And so I worked in partnership with the cultural counselor there named Danny Edwards at the time. He took me around and introduced me to Blackfeet bundle keepers. There's a ceremonial people who are responsible for these ritual practices that happen seasonally in the Blackfeet Nation. And I interviewed and talked with a lot of them about how you would undertake a Blackfeet traditional model. In addition, Danny was a member of the Crazy Dog Society, which is a grassroots neo-traditional society of people committed to what they call revitalizing the old Blackfeet religion. And so, we actually went into a ceremony of the Crazy Dog Society and asked for their help if they would be consider help being involved. And in fact, that's what happened. They were able to take over and lead the development of this alternative approach to treatment that would be based on Blackfeet approaches. It was what I call a pretty radically alternative treatment model. They came up with a summer cultural immersion camp, which was to take addiction clients and introduce them to life that was somewhat like what their pre-reservation ancestors might have lived. And so, was living on teepees out in the bush and practicing different ceremonies and so on. This was to be facilitated not by counselors who were trained up in how to do addiction treatment, but by members of the Crazy Dog Society. The underlying premise was this idea of socialization into the old Blackfeet religion. And I think the most important understanding of how healing and therapeutic benefit happened here was spirituality, the idea that healing and recovery comes from ceremony and ritual practices that circulate life. And these are powerful indigenous ideas that are, from time immemorial, essentially, about how these things work. So we piloted this Blackfeet culture camp, as we called it, in 2012. The first question I had was, well, could we even pull it off? Like, could the Crazy Dogs run a camp? Would addiction treatment clients come to the camp? Would there be something to do every day? Would it be considered valuable and helpful by everyone involved? So we piloted it. It was sponsored by the Crystal Creek Lodge on behalf of their clients, staffed by the Crazy Dog Society members, although the counselors were there on site because, of course, they have, responsibility for these clients in case they're in crisis. They have legal responsibilities. And anything like this that's totally new and different is viewed with some caution by people. So we had 4 men who were willing to do it for just a 2-week trial effort and period. The camp really consisted of 3 different kinds of activities: traditional skills, cultural practices, and ritual participation. And so the very first thing we had to do was set up a camp of teepees. And so, learning how to set up a teepee, if you've never done it before, it's not, and you have to learn it. Indeed, setting up a double teepee for a conference council meeting was kind of especially challenging. But traditional skills included lodge painting, which the Blackfeet are long known for, painting the covers of their teepees, berry picking, sacred plant harvesting, tanning hides, collecting aniskim, which are thunderstones. They're fossilized ammonites that the Blackfeet have long understood to be power persons who could help. Cultural practices like storytelling, tracing your family ancestry, visiting Chief Mountain, which is the most sacred site to the Blackfeet, a decision-making exercise, and ritual participation. So we put up the teepees at night and had a pipe ceremony. The very next day, the only thing we did that day was to go out to the bush and build and participate in a sweat lodge ceremony. So we went to one of the Crazy Dog transfer rites. So, the religious part was really important, in some ways, the anchoring framework for the entire camp. The ethos of this camp was really important and contradicted or contrasted in important ways from addiction treatment in the usual residential program that these clients were in. First of all, it was much more leisurely paced. It wasn't so rigidly structured. In treatment, you get up at 8, you eat breakfast by 8:30, you're at your first group by 9, you go all day, you have a little free time at night, you go to bed at 10, the lights are out and the doors are locked. This was not like that. We were living in camps in the bush. People got up when they got up. They were some bust in to shower at the treatment setting before coming back. If we left at noon, that was okay. If we got back at 10 p.m., that was okay. If bedtime was at 1 a.m., that was okay. Leisurely paced. Also loosely scripted. In other words, there had to be clear ideas for what was supposed to happen on a given day. But if something came up that made something a better alternative, or something was blocked by, a change in plan, then you could just transfer in something else. And the Crazy Dogs did this expertly, that we had something to do importantly every day, even though sometimes plans did have to change. It was sensitively guided. This is really important, because in some of our cultural traditional practices, that we have some cultural authorities and leaders who are kind of hardliners. My way or the highway. This is the only way you can do this, and that can be very off-putting to people who don't really know a lot about it. And so the fact that this leadership was much more flexible and accommodating and willing to explain things and more flexible was very, very important. The staff monitored, as I said, you've got to have like actual counselors there, because it's a legal and ethical obligation. And it was also community engaged. So Crazy Dogs led it, but the Crazy Dog Society, there may be 3 to 5 people who were there every day. There might have been 25 more people who came on some days, but not other days. People came when they could during the 2-week period. And so the boundary, again, between clientele and the community really dissolved. We've been out on the hill picking sage, for example. There'd be 30 people milling around, and people wouldn't even know who the clients were versus who the Crazy Dogs were. And it didn't matter. As one of the Crazy Dogs observed, this would be good for any Blackfeet person. It doesn't really matter that it's here for treatment in this particular context. So just some impressions before we wrap up here. This was really memorable and inspiring. It's be hard to overstate the sacred and socio-political significance of undertaking your own approach to therapeutic practice and trying to treat people from your own community in your own way. It was unrecognizable as an addiction treatment. There was none of this confess you're an alcoholic, cast your feelings into words, talk about trauma from your past. There really was no mandate to talk about those kinds of things in the way that might be quite typical. It centered traditional spirituality and religious experience, as I've said. It promoted a pretty genuine sense of community and belonging. And this is really important, because if someone's contended with addiction in a community and they go through treatment, they're going to come out of that treatment and they're going to need people and places to go, people to spend time with who are not their old drinking buddies, for example. And so this sense of community and belonging, basically the Crazy Dogs were interested and open to some of these folks coming to join in their activities thereafter. And it was valued by clients. And we don't have time today, but I, of course, sat down to interview all of the clients and for an hour each or something. And it's not that they didn't have, suggestions for improvement or even a critique here and there. I mean, they were willing to share some things that they thought could be better, but by and large, they were very favorable and felt like it was a much better alternative than the kind of addiction treatment they were getting in the residential program in the center. There are lots of questions for future research. What's interesting is that we didn't have a way to formally evaluate this with just 4 participants, and I wasn't able to be involved after this initial summer, but the Blackfeet Culture Camp lived on. Even though they had limited resources, the Blackfeet Nation's addiction program offered this for 2 or 3 consecutive summers thereafter. They recruited a lot more clients to be involved. They refined and changed it in response to feedback. So it kept going for a time, I think at least until the director had to leave for a different job. But I think it raises a question about the scientific outcome evaluation that I told you we were interested in, because it's pretty hard to do that if it's only one community. They've designed it for themselves. The numbers of clients are kind of small. It's hard to undertake science under those kinds of conditions. So the question I had when I was done is, what if there are irreducible trade-offs between development of community-driven post-colonial interventions like the Blackfeet Culture Camp on the one hand, and on the other hand, the design of portable, replicable, and scientifically evaluable interventions? What if you have to choose between those things and you can't have them both? What would be the direction to go? Okay, I'll just highlight a few take-home points, and then we'll have some chance for discussion and exchange. So in terms of take-home points, the first one is that community mental health services for Indigenous people are vexed by this post-colonial predicament. That is, we have real needs on the one hand, but the services that are on offer are not necessarily helpful or congruent for many members of the community. Professional and Indigenous therapeutic traditions diverge in some really substantial cultural ways. They're not the same kinds of logics or rationales behind them. As we've seen, Indigenous approaches tend to be spiritual and sacred and religious, whereas mental health professionals practice secular kinds of treatments and approaches. There's a broad interest, however, in reformulating mental health services towards greater cultural commensurability for Indian people. And a compelling point of departure in this is this Indigenous claim I told you, that our culture is our treatment. The idea that what we most need in our communities to recover from addiction and trauma and suicidality is to go back to our traditions, to harness our cultural practices, and to engage in spiritual ceremonial work toward greater healing. These culture as treatment projects, if communities are allowed to kind of design them in their own way and on their own terms, can look really different from recognizable forms of treatment and intervention. And finally, scientific evaluation of these projects remains probably a worthy thing to try figure out how to do, but it's not always going to be obvious or easy to be able to develop and study outcomes. And that's the researcher in me talking. I know that you're not all necessarily researchers, but that's part of the lesson here. So I have written about all of this stuff in various ways. I try to make my writing available on my website to download. And so my name is Gone. It's the English word gone. Our family name comes from the fact that my great-grandfather went to government boarding school on Fort Belknap Reservation. And the practice at that time is you would take a young child, he was 5 when he started, and they would take your father's Indian name as your new surname for your family and give you a Christian first name. So his father's name was Gone to War. And so they called him Fred Gone or Freddie Gone. And so we're the Gone family at Fort Belknap, but Gone to War is the original name. That's why my website is called Gone to War. So you go to my website, you can download this stuff if you like, learn more about these projects and other things I've been involved with. Well, let me stop sharing my screen. You've all been very patient and wonderful in listening to these things. And I just want to have a chance now to invite or open up however you've been handling exchange, questions, or conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. All right, we have a microphone that Annabelle is going to take around, so we will take any questions for Dr. Gone, who has, I think, the best last name that I've ever heard. So anybody would like to please raise your hand if you have a question. Dr. Gone, we have a lot of counselors in this room. And some therapists, some folks that work in psychological services. So I know that it was really an enlightening way for us to think about different ways for us to approach the way that we serve our students and ourselves personally. I'm buying time until I see a hand. Ourselves personally, so we see a hand right here. One of our counselors, wonderful.
Hi, Letty Serna, thank you. I'm a counselor and I also was trained in mental health, community mental health. So it really, I want to thank you for that because it really just resonated for me because of the fact that, working with some of our students, they may go through some difficult situations in their lives. And, for me, it's always really important to also make sure that we're finding some culturally relevant support for them as they journey. And unfortunately, I think in the years past, I think we've lost a lot of those services instead of gained them. I remember a time where it was fairly easy. I'm really dating myself, but that's okay. It was called the Eric book, which had a ton of resources for community and so forth that were more culturally based and culturally relevant support services. And now it's so much harder to find. So I really appreciate your work and bringing it back to the healing practices of our Indigenous roots. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Another question at the back. Go ahead, Dr. Gone, if you have anything, go ahead and interject. We'll give another question coming up from another counselor.
Hi, my name is Fatima Jenna. I'm a counselor. I have a clarifying question, and sorry if I missed it while I was taking notes, but the 4 men who went through the program, what is their status now? Did that help in their addiction?
Which program were you asking about, please?
Oh, the one where the 4 men, the last one.
The Blackfeet culture camp, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, as I said, I wasn't able to be involved past that initial summer. And as I said, they offered it for summers. So there was enthusiasm about it. And people locally obviously thought that it was important and valuable to do. Now, in terms of whether people were able to recover from their addiction by going through that program, that is a scientific question. That is not easy to answer. And I talked a little bit about why it's hard to do science in that community and then those kinds of approaches to programs. But the other thing is in addiction treatment in general, it's not easy to do. And the reason for that is because recovery takes a long time before you conclude that someone is truly recovered. So I think they estimate is something like 6 years before someone is really truly considered recovered, because of addiction is often a chronic and relapsing condition. Indeed, some of the men who participated in the program had been through addiction treatment. I think someone had been through maybe 8 times before. So it's not uncommon to cycle through here and there again and again before recovery kicks in. And of course, tragically, some people never fully recover. So it sort of depends on the ability to track outcomes over time. And we were not able to do that in this project. And it would be a great thing to be able to do. And there's a project I didn't talk about today, which was the next project I undertook in the effort to try have a program that could be implemented across multiple settings and communities, so that there would be at least a possibility for doing some of that scientific outcome assessment.
All right, we have a question from another counselor, Isaac.
Dr. Gunn, thank you for your presentation. My name is Isaac Escoto, I'm a counselor here. A theme from your presentation here is fitting folks into a Eurocentric model of trying to help them. And I'm wondering what your advice might be for services that educational institutions serve students, and how do we include ways to serve students that are not all Eurocentric. So for example, expecting students to come to make an appointment themselves, come sit in a waiting room, wait until someone pops out from behind a wall, and then take you, ways of doing things that maybe aren't as comfortable or as traditional that folks might expect. So I'm wondering if you might have advice for how do we think of different ways, think outside the box of how we serve students and not necessarily expect them to fit into how higher education usually provides services.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And so, as I say, I don't do clinical practice. I decided to try do work with tribal communities to think outside the box in that way. So I'm extrapolating beyond my own personal experience in some ways, and maybe there's nothing that original in what I'll have to say. But I think we want to appreciate and just acknowledge that the way service delivery is usually structured in various institutions is pretty confining. I mean, a model or a stock clinic is you hire, really well trained professionals, clinicians, who usually see one person at a time for 50-minute sessions. And they get a pretty decent salary, and the clinic is trying to make sure it can cover the costs of those salaries while maximizing the number of people who benefit from the clinical hours. And so there's an investment of resources in people that sort of follows those pathways. I think the way to try to be more, have a different reach and a wider reach, is to get out of that model to a great degree when possible. So the first thing I think about with young people is, I'm 56 years old. I barely could relate to other 20-year-olds when I was 20. I certainly can't very well now. And so part of the answer, I think, is peer counseling. Like, what would it look like if the counseling center trained a whole peer counseling program where peer counselors helped to decide what the best, most effective approaches might look like, and they were, had a safety net of clinicians to do that? What if more of the services were delivered that way rather than in, one-on-one therapy kinds of things? The other thing I'm thinking is, encouraging self-help and making a space for self-help and mutual support in ways where it doesn't involve a clinician necessarily being on site at all, but there's, an institutionalization of come and do this. There's food, maybe things that are appealing or attractive. And I think the basic principle, if I were to try to suggest an alternative, is so much of counseling and therapy is premised on the idea of therapeutic talk. And therapeutic talk is just not how many people in modern America are socialized. I think, suburban soccer moms, I think it works great. That's how they're socialized. I think working class men, I think, folk of color, I don't think that's how people are socialized so much. And so counseling encounters the burden of having not only to socialize, but in some ways to undo the kind of communicative patterns that we are socialized into and assimilate us into the therapeutic mandate. And I think that's a big source of problems with outreach. So just trying to come up with alternative therapeutic approaches that are not premised or based on casting your feelings into words.
Thank you so much, Dr. Don. I think we have one more question up here. Counselor Voltaire.
Hi, Dr. Gant. This is Voltaire. I'm a counselor. I also teach psychology, so I'm quite intrigued with your research. And what I'm hearing is, you started off with this idea of colonization, and what I really heard from your talk is this idea of liberation. It's like, at this point, counseling relies on a counselor and these mental professionals, but really, it's all upon us as a community to help each other. And really getting away from these ideas like, well, yeah, if you need mental health, go to a counselor, go to a therapist. And when you talk about peer counseling, it's like, oh, that's something that we all do. When I have somebody come into my office, like one of my colleagues will come to my office, this is really peer counseling. They're not talking about therapy. So really, what I hear is like, how do we liberate this idea of counseling in a system that we have called education, where you have to go to a particular office. And what I'm really hearing is like, okay, it's upon us, but how do we work in this system that we call higher education, where we have funding models, where scientific inquiry, and metrics are so important, and then here you are talking about, it's kind of hard to find the metrics for this because like the population is small, but not. So I was just kind of curious about that.
Yeah, I think as I think about community mental health in particular, and it's a little different on a college campus, of course, because you've only got students coming for maybe 4 years or maybe 6. It's not that many, is the point. But in our communities, we already have all kinds of people who are engaged in natural helping, what we call natural helping. I just think of like in my own extended family, there are certain people who have, there's certain people who have really chaotic lives and certain people who have really stable lives. And the people with stable lives are often in a position to be really helpful to those who have chaotic lives and to coach and support and guide them until they achieve some stability, which often takes a little bit of time. And the thing is that people who are natural helpers can be overrun and overwhelmed by the nature of the chaos from time to time. And so I even think about looking to identifying and reaching out to and figuring out how to support in some formal way people who are good at helping naturally in their own settings with their own families or other community members, or in the educational context, maybe certain student leaders or students who others turn to for good advice. Trying to identify a network of those people and trying to not only orient them to, okay, here's where you should know that probably a person really needs help from a trained clinician, and here's some ways to help them get that help, to support it basically, and to help them do their work and to make sure that they're not overwhelmed or overrun quite so often because they have someone to turn to when things get out of hand or beyond control. So natural helping is really, really key and important to try to identify and to harness. I think in the educational setting, the challenge is that, they're coming and they're going, but it would be nice to be able to do prevention. So this gets back to structures again, like, for example, I think where a crisis can happen for our students, especially I'm thinking of non-traditional students who are coming, from not middle-class backgrounds, right? For whom a college campus is pretty overwhelming, and the academic demands can be unfamiliar if they're coming from a low-resource school, where they didn't have, that kind of Cadillac education that some students are privileged to have. I think, programs that orient them, that support them before college starts, maybe structuring first-year classes and seminars that are pass-fail so they can get the hang of college life. Maybe they're assigned a mentor who's a senior, who's been through it, who also comes from their class or ethnic background, who can kind of guide them in their first semester. A lot of it's about supporting to prevent bad things from happening. That's the ideal, I think, in mental health, is we know it's cost effective over the long haul, and that's in dollars and cents, not even to talk about the human cost of all of the suffering that happens when someone's life goes off the rails and they end up with a diagnosable mental disorder. But if we can engage and invest in supporting prevention so that people never have to experience that, that's the better way to go. And it turns out it is cost efficient, except that it's long-term cost efficient, not in the usual political cycle.
Thank you so much. To the last two questions that we just got from Voltaire, and Isaac, what I think we could think about is, what if we reimagined the way that we counsel our students? Because last time I checked, all the counselors are here, the Dean of Counseling is here, and everyone who runs the college and President's Cabinet is here. So if you all decide that you want to shift things and make things a little bit different, try some different approaches, psychological services, mental health services, they're all here. It's an opportunity for us to think about what he is actually doing in practice, rethinking the way that we provide services to students, especially for our students of color. And I believe that we probably will heal a little bit ourselves because we are disconnected from our own indigenous ways. We have forgotten the ways of our ancestors and do not know what our ancestors did for healing because we're generations removed from the colonization. So to just reflect and go back within yourself and think, what is the healing that sounds like it will work for me? Maybe it's a nature walk with students. Maybe we do sound baths. Maybe we do some of what we did today. And that's why I wanted to provide that for you today, so you can see an example for yourselves and your own healing, and also for us to think about rethinking the way that we serve our students. So with that, Dr. Gon, thank you so much for intriguing us with this new